Hello there, welcome to another Pyroseminar. This month I wanted to look at the relationship between atheism and theism. And I wanted to do that because actually next week, if you're watching this live, next week is the beginning of another Atheism for Lent decentering practice. So as many of you know, I run and have run in the past what I call decentering practices, which are various practices designed to kind of disorient you and reorient you. That's why they're called obviously decentering practices. And one of those is Atheism for Lent. And I've been running Atheism for Lent for, my goodness, like over 20 years now, off and on. Like there'll be a few years where I don't do it, but off and on I've been running it for about 20 years. And it's, as you probably know, it's over Lent for 40 days. Every day of Lent you get a reflection. And it might be a piece of music, an audio recording, a piece of writing, a piece of art. But it's all designed to explore the interrelationship between theism and atheism, and to kind of explore atheism as a type of purification process, as a type of disorienting meditative process. And as we approach Good Friday, where Christ cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's really a delving into that experience at a deep level. And then once a week I give a talk. So this is a standalone seminar, but it might just kind of provide a little bit more background to that decentering practice, but also to what I mean whenever I talk about the dance between atheism and theism. So whenever people first think about the relationship between theism and atheism, they think of it as quite opposed. These are enemies in two different camps, and never the twain shall meet. And so whenever I talk about Atheism for Lent, it can initially sound a little bit disconcerting. And in fact, I like that. That's part of the reason why I've called this practice Atheism for Lent, which I took from Merrill Westphal, a book that he wrote called Suspicion and Faith, where the subtitle was Atheism for Lent. But the reason why I like that term is partly because it's a little bit jarring. At first when you hear it, you're like, okay, Lent, that's a very religious practice. Atheism is the rejection of religion. So like, how do those two fit together in the same sentence? But it's not just for the sake of being a little bit jarring so that maybe people look into it. There's also, I think, a deep truth to it. There is some sort of deep relationship between the religious tradition and the theistic tradition and atheistic critique. And in this seminar, I kind of want to draw out a number of reasons why you can think of theism and atheism as actually interlinked in a very, very profound way. And as we look at that, this is also a good introduction to dialectics. And you'll know that I've talked about dialectics a number of times in the last couple of years. And I've done a couple of courses that have explored it and some Pyroseminars. But this is a good concrete example of the way dialectics unfolds. So to start with, let's do some definitions. And we'll start, we've got, by the way, what I want to do at some stage is get a board behind me so I can start to put diagrams up. I think that would be very useful. So that will be coming. But for now, you're just going to have to use your imagination as I try to define theism and atheism. So I'm going to do 4 different types of definition. I'm going to define theisms, atheisms, metaphysical theism, and metaphysical atheism. So on the right hand side, you've got metaphysical atheism and the various regional atheisms. And on the left hand side, you've got metaphysical theism and various regional theisms. So what do I mean by regional theisms? I think I get that term actually from Jean-Luc Marion. I think he used that term in his book God Without Being. And a regional theism is basically any of the beliefs that we see concretely historically in the world. There's hundreds of different gods, hundreds of different types of belief systems out there about God or the gods. Now, we could actually start to even put them into subspecies. So we could say like maybe there's 400 or 500 different theisms that we can see in the world around us. or that have existed at one time. And there is an infinite number that could exist in the future. But we could maybe break them down into polytheisms. So polytheisms are all of those theisms in which there are a multitude of gods, right? Then you have henotheisms. Henotheisms are any beliefs in which there are a multitude of gods, but there is one God that rules over the rest of them, right? So you can see even within the Bible, you start with a type of polytheistic notion. You can see at the early stages of the Hebrew scriptures that kind of very quickly kind of generates and modifies into a type of henotheism. And then you've got monotheisms. Monotheisms are where there is only one God, one ultimate reality that grounds, sustains, or out of which everything arises. And again, you can see that movement within the Hebrew scriptures from kind of polytheism to henotheism to monotheism. And then you have like a Trinitarian monotheism, which is very interesting, and we're not going to delve too deeply into that, but you can think of Trinitarian monotheism as a type of gap within monotheism, a type of non-oneness of the one, right? So there's a type of, you can conceptualize it in numerous ways. Sometimes people think of it, God, Son, and the Holy Ghost is in the sense the relation between the two. But it's basically a type of fragmented or fractured monotheism. So you've got these types of beliefs. And then metaphysical theism could be described as what all classical theisms hold in common, which is the idea that behind the veil of appearance, there is some ultimate reality that either grounds or sustains all of what appears, all of the contingent aspects of reality that we see in our everyday life. So it grounds it, it sustains it, it arises, everything we know arises out of it. So there you go. So regional theisms, all of the different kind of concrete historical theisms that we see in the world, and we see them in terms of polytheism, henotheisms, monotheisms, and then this more interesting kind of a manifold monotheism of Trinitarian monotheism. So then atheisms. So what are atheisms? Well, regional atheisms are rejections of theisms. So every atheism is a type of rejection of a theism. And that's why a lot of atheisms, they have a different feel, right? Christian atheisms have different vibe to Jewish atheisms, to Hindu atheisms, to Buddhist atheisms, because the negation, what they are negating or rejecting, is different in each case. And so there is this interesting sense in which regional atheisms are always a rejection of something positive, something that's been put out there, a thesis. They are the antithesis of a thesis. They are the rejection of a position. And then the most kind of like a kind of universal atheism that we know in classical terms is metaphysical atheism, which is a rejection of all of these types of gods in advance, right? So that, in other words, there is no kind of grounding reality, oneness behind the veil of appearances that grounds and sustains everything. So there you go. Hopefully that's kind of clear enough. Regional theisms are like certain beliefs in gods, and you can get an encyclopedia of gods and you can see all of the different theisms that have been collated in the world. You've got regional atheisms, which are the rejection of those. Then you have metaphysical theism, which is kind of what all of these classical theisms hold in common. And you've got metaphysical atheism, which is kind of like the rejection of that very notion of some grounding and ultimate reality. Now, out of this, we can already start to see that there is a relationship between these positions, right? We already start to see that, just like there's no up without down or right without left, there's no theism without atheism, and there's no atheism without theism. So it's easier to say the latter first. So there's no atheism without theism, because atheism is the rejection of a theism. It's rejecting something that is postulated, something that is given out. And as a result, if there's no theism, there's no atheism that it's rejecting. And you can think about it in terms of like the infinite number of theisms that don't exist, right? There's 400 different gods or different types of theistic systems in the world. Well, there's an infinite number that don't exist that we could imagine. But there's no atheism against those because they don't exist, right? You don't have to have an atheism against some kind of like god of the, the fish god or something like that, because we don't have that system to reject. So you can see how atheism relies on theism, but also theism generates and relies on atheism. As soon as you make a claim to a certain god, you're making that claim against a backdrop of a possible negation of that claim, right? Even if the negation doesn't exist, as soon as you make the claim, then it is, even if it's just a potential, it has within it the ability to be rejected, to be critiqued. So there's a certain sense in which these two things exist together. They're logically connected. And perhaps, I don't think we'll get to here in the seminar, but you can imagine a kind of beyond of theism and atheism. There might be another way to get beyond this dialectic, right? Some people talk about agnosticism. Agnosticism is different from agnosticism. Agnosticism is where you think that the question and the very way it's framed is meaningless, right? It's a atheism and theism are kind of meaningless positions that generate each other, and so agnosticism is a way to name a type of position which doesn't pay any heed to either of them, right? But we're in this historical back and forth, right, where theism, a certain belief in gods or God is produced, and then atheism is the antithesis. It is the rejection of that position. So that's the first thing to say is, okay, they're interrelated logically. There's some sort of interconnection between them. The second thing but to notice is that it's not just that they are connected, it's that atheism can be seen to arise out of theism. It is the potential, it's a potentiality that bubbles within every theistic belief. And what I mean by that is, as soon as you make a claim to what God is like, anyone who takes that claim seriously and looks at it seriously and looks at it deeply will eventually come to see contradictions or problems or issues within that belief. And so as you go deeper into the study of it and take it very, very seriously, you begin to find that there are problems, there are logical inconsistencies. So a very basic example is one of the earliest critiques of God is the tripartite argument, which says there are three statements that can't all be true, right? And the first statement is there is an all-powerful God. The second statement is that this God is all good, purely good, benevolent. And then the third statement is there is unnecessary human suffering. The argument is the three of those can't exist together. Either there is no unnecessary suffering in the world, and then you can have an all-powerful, all-benevolent God, or there is natural suffering in the world, and then you have to ditch one of those two, right? Either God is not all-powerful, right, is benevolent, but can't stop the unnecessary suffering in the universe, or God is all-powerful, but then you have to get rid of the idea that God is benevolent, because then why would God not stop that, right? So there is a view of God is put forward, and then out of that and out of looking at it comes this critique. And by the way, another concrete example of this in practice is the fact that some of the greatest kind of atheistic critiques arise even concretely out of the theological tradition. So for example, in the 1600s, there was a guy called Jean Melier, right? And he was a parish priest, a very good parish priest, really cared for his congregation. When he died, he gave all his money to the congregation. He lived a very meagre life and gave his money to those in need, and actually a couple of times stood up for his congregation against the lord of the village or whatever. So he was a pretty very genuine guy. He is generally credited. He's very unknown, but he's actually generally credited as being the first person to write a systematic critique of Christianity, a systematic defense of atheism. So it's kind of like basically what happened is he was writing this book, this manuscript all through his life, just quietly, nobody knew. And then when he died, they discovered it over 3 manuscripts, and he called it My Testament. And it was this incredibly vicious and passionate critique of God and Christianity, the Bible, the whole works. And he'd just been quietly doing this to be discovered, as I say, after he died. And it's called Testament. And this book is quite a large book. It's quite repetitive. It's really interesting. It's quite well written. Is the first kind of systematic atheistic critique of Christianity and of God. And it's by a priest, and someone who was a priest all of their life. Or you take Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a very pious person in his youth, and actually all through his life, there is something of a type of prophetic figure about him, the way he speaks, the way he writes. There is a religious fervour. So his kind of atheism is very, very rooted in a deep understanding of the Christian tradition. Also, Feuerbach is a great example of a philosopher who was really the first philosopher to give an alternative reading, alternative explanation for the rise of Christianity that was intellectually credible, right? That didn't require God. And he saw himself as a friend of the theologians. He was an expert on Luther. He was incredibly well read in theology. Or take the example of Freud. I'll do one more. Freud, his work is a very much a depth within the Jewish tradition. You know, he really understood that tradition. It marks his writing in a very, very deep way. And this is all understandable because if you want to critique something, the best thing to do is to go as deeply into it as you can. And when you go deeply into it, you find the negative, you find the negation. Right? So think about theism as the positive and atheism as the negative. Positive in the terms of a thesis, something positive is something is posited, and then the negation is it is rejected, it's negated. And so when you go into the thesis, the positing position, you find these deadlocks, you find these contradictions, you find these problems, and you go deeper into them, you begin to negate the original position. But then out of that comes a new position, right? And a new ways of articulating the notion of God comes out of this. So already then I've said atheism and theism, you can see, are interconnected. 2, you can start to see that atheism actually arises out of theism. It comes from the heart of it, not as some sort of external enemy, but it kind of blossoms from within. And then thirdly, and I've kind of mentioned this, thirdly, you start to see that atheism is actually the driving motor of theology and of theism. It's the driving motor because it postulates negation, which then needs to be responded to. And the response has to come from the heart of the atheistic critique. It takes it seriously, wrestles with it, moves with it, and then new positions are posited. Now, always the danger with this negation, this idea of negation, is that it goes into a dead end, a cul-de-sac, right? Which is kind of radical skepticism. So this dialectic stops because radical skepticism comes in, and it's like, okay, so there's no progression, no movement, none of this dialectic kind of then a new position is articulated, which itself then is critiqued. Now, the reason why radical skepticism is a wrong direction to go is purely logically it can't work. So, at a very basic level, if radical skepticism says we can know nothing, then it falls into a type of contradiction, because that is a claim to knowledge, right? So, or if radical skepticism says there is no truth, right? Again, that is a kind of truth claim. So again, there's actually something that you can find out of it. Or even if skepticism says, there's no such thing as objects in the world, no red objects in the world, you can still then go, but there is a concept of redness, right? That exists in your mind. So radical skepticism kind of falls into just as a dead end. This ongoing process is actually where something is posited, a position is given, you go deeply into that position, you find the contradictions, you find the fissures, and then that itself opens up a deeper, more sustained, you call it like I want to use a word like steadfast, or a kind of more stable notion. So you start off maybe with very primitive notions of God, right? The gods is like a soap opera in the sky, right? And so it's a very superstitious notion of how the gods work. They're just bigger versions of ourselves. They're the equivalent of the Kardashians or whatever today. And then through the negation of that, the critique of it, then we start to develop a more and more complex kind of understanding through constant negation. Now, this is not dissimilar from mysticism. The mysticism of someone like Maimonides. Maimonides, I think I'm pronouncing him right. It's been 25 years since I've read him, but he had this type of thing where the more you negate a position. Say you're trying to say what a ship is, right? I'm trying to explain what a ship is, and you ask me questions. You don't know what I'm talking about. I think there's a game called 20 Questions where you do this. You go, is it round? Is it a mammal? Is it a living organism? Is it made of wood? Whatever. And I keep saying no. You keep asking these questions. I keep saying no. The repeated failure actually starts to generate a kind of picture of what you're talking about. And so this kind of the mystical tradition is the importance of the negative, which kind of but with the idea that you never get to the positive description, but the negation is itself productive. So this process is ongoing in history, and then that's why there's a way in which you could argue that the move from polytheism to henotheism to say monotheism is a type of deepening of a response to atheism, of a response to the negation. So again, just to repeat, theism and atheism require each other. Atheism kind of erupts or blossoms out of theism. Atheism is the driving motor of the development of theistic thought, of metaphysics. And then lastly, and this is the more difficult point, is that as you go through this process and you deepen it and it moves, at first you're thinking that, I am moving towards the truth. I'm getting to some more stable position. But there's a certain point, and this is what Hegel is doing in his book Phenomenology of Spirit, is that there's a certain point in which you realize that the constant failure to get to the truth, this dialectic movement, this negation of atheism, and then the positive statement of theism, that is the truth. That's the eternal. That movement, that impossibility of articulating that onward movement is kind of like the basic structure of reality itself. That reality has a dialectic structure. And so it's a move from I'm moving towards the truth to the truth is the movement itself, right? So at the first, you're going like, I'm moving towards the truth. And then you kind of shift your focus a little bit and you go, hold on a second. It's actually the movement itself that's the truth. This is not dissimilar from process theology, I guess. I haven't done much in process theology, but there is this notion of movement and process that is the the nature of the absolute, the divine life. And at this point, atheism and theism are not just intertwined, or not just logically necessary, or not just antagonistically kind of dancing with each other. Atheism is not just the motor that's driving things forward. They kind of come together in a kind of like what Hegel calls he calls it the unity of unity and difference, the reconciliation of unity and difference, which means that this movement itself, you find peace with it. It's kind of like, instead of it being vicious, it becomes productive. And that's what I mean when I write the term atheism with a dash through it, a/theism. This is the point at which you kind of enter into a space in which you see that these two positions, at the very beginning of the journey, you think they're absolutely opposed. And then you see, no, they're logically intertwined. And then you're like, oh my goodness, no, atheism is something that actually comes out of theism. And then you go, oh my goodness, it's the driving motor of theism. And then you go, oh, hold on a second. This very process of negation and then a new position coming out of that negation connects us with the very nature of reality itself. And I have talked about this on previous seminars. I've did the course Tyranny of Oneness that explores this as well. But the idea that this movement happens in various sciences and various academic disciplines, where in mathematics and biology and physics, you get to the point of seeing that there is a type of antagonism. Even like think of positive and negative charges, right? There's this dialectic thing that's actually at the very heart of reality. Evolution, in that biological organisms are in kind of like a conflictual relationship with their external environment, but also a conflictual relationship with their own biological system that generates transformation and change over millions of years. So this process that we're talking about in relation to theism and atheism is also a process that we see in the very nature of reality itself. And this comes to the theological cure. This brings us to this notion of a type of manifold, manifold monotheism, or Trinitarian monotheism, which simply means, taking the religious, the confessional dimension out of it, is this notion that the absolute God has a negation within God. And that, you can say, is the insight of the cross, where God says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where God experiences a gap within God, is what Hegel calls the moment of absolute knowledge. It's the moment in which we are able to reconcile the positive and the negative, theism and atheism, in one place. And the reason why this can be called a theological cure is, again, connecting with my wider work. And these seminars are all supposed to be interlinked, so I don't try to cover everything in the one talk. But in other seminars, I've looked at how the theological cure is, we want to get rid of the negation, the lack. We want to scapegoat it, put it onto somewhere else. We want to get rid of contradiction and make it into opposition. There is a wholeness, and the thing that is preventing wholeness is some other out there that is messing everything up. And the theological cure is the notion that actually you can't get rid of the contradiction. Contradiction is part of the reality of existence. You can't get rid of atheism without getting rid of theism. They are intertwined and interlinked, and actually the space beyond them is not some place of like some kind of utopian place where that affirmation and negation don't occur, but rather an a/theism, where we realize that this antagonism is the generative force of all life and all thought. This is what generates and fuels reality, and that's the theological cure, which, by the way, we see this in terms of political economy. This is what Marx was doing after Hegel, was applying this idea of contradiction to politics and the economy, and going, what are the contradictions within slave systems? What are the contradictions within feudalist systems? What are the contradictions within capitalist systems? And the notion is you are able to look at the contradictions, and as those contradictions become more and more intense, eventually they give way to a different system, a higher system. But what Hegel says, which is different from Marx, because Marx seems kind of like, sometimes he kind of like expresses the idea that we can get to a place beyond the contradiction. Hegel says you never get beyond the contradiction. The best society, the society that is healthiest, and the community that's healthiest, and the individual that is healthiest, is the one who is able to reconcile the contradiction, make it non-vicious, create basically an A/theism, an atheism. And in psychoanalysis, that's called the cure, right? Where the individual is able to come to terms with their conflictual desires and realize that there's no perfect thing that's going to get rid of that conflict. Within politics, this democracy, the idea that actually we have to take the conflict between variety of different people's interests and create a type of democratic system that allows those contradictions of people's desires to actually be productive to the development of society. And so maybe it'll be, how do we bring democracy into the workplace, right? And then in terms of, say, theology, in terms of philosophy, it is the acknowledgement that doubt, complexity, and ambiguity are part of the very motor of the absolute life. And once we grasp that, that is what can be called the community of the Holy Ghost, where God is the type of lack that exists among us, where we look after each other and we take responsibility for each other and we care for each other. Okay, I want to try and there was a lot in that, and so I want to try and sum it up in just a couple of minutes. And say that basically we started with the idea of regional theisms and regional atheisms. Atheisms are the rejections of theisms, and so they rely on each other, right? And as that dialectic moves forward, the theisms become more sophisticated, the atheisms become more sophisticated, until eventually we get to what you could call metaphysical theism, metaphysical atheism. And this process actually reveals a number of things. One, that atheism and theism are intertwined, just like up and down, left and right are intertwined. That atheism arises out of theism, because every time you position a belief about God, you go deep enough into that position, you will find tensions and deadlocks and contradictions. So therefore then, atheism is also the driving force, the driving motor of the increasing complexity of the concepts of theism. And then finally, this move in which we learn that this progression towards the truth that we're experiencing is actually the truth. That this gives us an insight into what it means to be human, and it gives us an insight into physical reality. It gives us an insight into the ground out of which all reality arises. Okay, I will leave it there. Thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully some of you will be doing Atheism for Lent, which, by the way, is a concrete reflection of this. It's not primarily an academic course, but what you'll be doing is you'll be experiencing this movement, right? So the first week is the first few days are just orienting you. Then the first real week is the standard arguments against the existence of God that we can trace right back to the Greeks. Then there is the mystical response to that, which takes that critique seriously and then postulates a different understanding of God. Then the materialist critiques that critique mysticism. Then the kind of more materialist theologians who take seriously that critique of mysticism and kind of again develop a different, more complex notion of God. And then out of that into the contemporary period, where we start to enter into this notion of these two positions being completely intertwined. So what you'll do in Atheism for Lent is kind of get a concrete feel of what I've been talking about here. So hopefully some of you will do it, or maybe some of you have done it in the past, but it is about kind of experiencing this dialectic movement that I've expressed, kind of feeling it over 40 days. So I will see some of you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.